This is Kant and the Duty to Promote One's Own Happiness by Sam Kahn. And, yep, here we go. As always, feel free to ask me questions, and the link for this will be in the show notes if you're watching this later, or you can always type !paper, and the link will pop up in chat if you're here live. In the Metaphysics of Morals, Kant argues that human agents have a general duty to promote the happiness of others. That is, Kant argues that human agents have a general duty to adopt the happiness of others as an end. Kant's argument for the duty of benevolence is as follows. I want everyone else to be benevolent to me. Hence, I ought also to be benevolent toward everyone else. But since all others, with the exception of myself, would not be all, so that the maxim would not have within it the universality of a law, which is still necessary for imposing obligation, the law making benevolence a duty will include myself as an object of benevolence in the command of practical reason. This does not mean that I am thereby under obligation to love myself, for this happens unavoidably apart from any command, so there is no obligation to do it. It means instead that law-giving reason, which includes the whole species and so myself as well, in its idea of humanity as such, includes me as giving universal law along with all others in the duty of mutual benevolence in accordance with the principle of equality, and permits you to be benevolent to yourself on the condition of your being benevolent to every other as well, for it is only in this way that your maxim of beneficence qualifies for a giving of a universal law, the principle on which every law of duty is based. And this is why no one reads Kant if they don't have to. Excuse me. Basically, alright, they're going to explain. Why bother let them explain this? In this passage, Kant argues that agents, as a matter of fact, want others to be benevolent to them. However, he thinks it follows from this that agents ought to be benevolent to others. Moreover, because a maximum to be benevolent to others would not have the universality required of a law, the duty of benevolence must be a duty to be benevolent to all. Yeah, because it wouldn't just be other people, it would be benevolent to everyone. But Kant stops short of saying that there is a general duty to promote one's own happiness. Although he concedes that the duty of benevolence is a duty towards everyone, he argues that this should not be understood as conferring an obligation to love oneself. Kant argues that there is no obligation to love oneself because this happens unavoidably. Instead of being understood as entailing a duty to love oneself, Kant argues that the duty to be benevolent to all should be understood as giving one permission to love oneself. In particular, it is permissible to love oneself on the condition that one be benevolent toward others. Thus, although the duty of benevolence, when formulated with universality, as it should be according to Kant, is a duty to be benevolent to all, Kant does not think that there is a duty to be benevolent to oneself. This takes a very strong position that you inevitably love yourself. I think that quite often people do not like themselves. And so the idea that it's going to happen inevitably is just mistaken. Okay. Author says, in this paper I argue that Kant should not have said this. I argue that Kant should have conceded that agents do have an obligation to promote their own happiness. The paper is divided into 4 sections. In the first, I argue that Kant thinks it is possible for agents in deliberation not to choose to pursue their own happiness. In the second, I point out that the argument against a duty to promote one's own happiness cannot, on pain of inconsistency, be based merely on the fact that one has an immediate inclination to do so. In the third, I discuss Kant's argument for an indirect duty to promote one's own happiness. In the fourth, I return to section 27 to conclude that Kant should have conceded that agents have an obligation to promote their own happiness. Yeah, this seems right. This is my immediate response too, was that it is possible for agents in deliberation not to choose to pursue their own happiness. You might not like yourself and you might do things that harm yourself. It is possible for an agent to choose to not to choose to pursue their own happiness. Of course, Kant probably would define happiness as what you're doing, but that seems like a very narrow view, because happiness, you can do things that are hard that don't make you happy in the short term but will make you happy in the long term, and so it'd be very hard to exactly define what it is to not, if you want to always define yourself to be pursuing your happiness, yes, but then that you're not going to get the right sort of happiness I think Kant needs. So I think this author, I mean, just this setup, again, I'm thinking what the author wants me to think here, that the idea that Kant says you always automatically pursue your own happiness. Yeah, people don't know what's going to make them happy. And people may actively work against what makes them happy for weird reasons usually, but it happens. Like, and I don't even think that's uncommon. Okay. 1. When duty and happiness meet. Is this like when Harry met Sally? Like it takes them 15 years to get together? In his discussion of the highest good, Kant is careful to distinguish his views from those associated with Epicureanism and Stoicism. According to Kant, Epicureanism and Stoicism make similar mistakes. Epicureanism equates the pursuit of happiness with the pursuit of virtue. According to the doctrine of Epicureanism, as Kant represents it, to be prudent is to be virtuous. Thus, there is nothing more to virtue than counsels of prudence. Stoicism equates the pursuit of virtue with the pursuit of happiness. According to the doctrine of Stoicism, according to Kant, true happiness is the contentment that arises from consciousness of virtue. Thus, Kant argues as follows. Of the ancient Greek schools, there were, strictly speaking, only two, which in determining the concept of the highest good, followed one and the same method insofar as they did not let virtue and happiness hold as two different elements of the highest good, and consequently sought the unity of the principle in accordance with the rule of identity. But they differed in turn in their choice of which of the two was to be the fundamental concept. The Epicurean said, to be conscious of one's aim leading to happiness is a virtue. The Stoic said, to be conscious of one's virtue is happiness. For the first, prudence was equivalent to morality. For the second, who chose a higher designation for virtue, morality alone was true wisdom. In contrast with the ancient Greek schools, Kant does not think that virtue and happiness are the same thing. Kant thinks that the connection between virtue and happiness is not analytic, therefore, insofar as there is a connection between virtue and happiness, it must be synthetic. In the highest good, virtue leads to happiness as cause and effect. Okay, I mean, I'm always just like, well, whatever Kant says is wrong, so I'm going to have to go agree with either the Stoics or the Epicureans here. That's just my initial reaction. Kant concedes that there is an analog of happiness that must necessarily accompany consciousness of virtue, but this is not the same as happiness. This is self-satisfaction. Thus Kant argues, this word is self-satisfaction, which in its strict meaning always designates only a negative satisfaction with one's existence, in which one is conscious of needing nothing. Freedom and the consciousness of freedom as an ability to follow the moral law with an unyielding disposition is independence from inclinations, at least as motives determining, even if not as affecting our desire, and so far as I am conscious of this freedom in following my moral maxims, it is the sole source of an unchangeable contentment necessarily combined with it and resting on no special feeling, and this can be called intellectual contentment. Aesthetic contentment, improperly so called, which rests on satisfaction of the inclinations, however refined they may be made out to be, can never be adequate to what is thought about contentment. For the inclinations change, grow with indulgence, one allows them, and always leave behind a greater void than one had thought to fill. Yeesh. From this, it may be seen that Kant does not think that duty and happiness always coincide. Moreover, Kant thinks that there can be situations in which agents have a duty to do something that is contrary to their happiness, and conversely, there might be situations in which the pursuit of one's happiness is contrary to duty. A Kantian example of this might be Thomas More, who was executed for refusing to swear his allegiance to the act of secession. It is likely that More represented himself to himself as doing his duty at the expense of his earthly happiness. Yeah, I mean, of course, duty, like what you have to do, you only get to do what you want to do sometimes. The rest of the time you do what you have to do, like as far as duty goes. But yeah, this self-satisfaction, it only designates that you're okay with things. It's not happiness though. So that's interesting that Kant has this very because it might be an analog to doing the moral thing, and then the supererogatory, going over and above. So you've got self-satisfaction, and then you've got the happiness, which is the going over and above as far as being happy with yourself. So that's interesting that he has this secondary tier again. Okay. Now, it is vital to Kant's theory that if an agent is in a situation in which morality requires him or her, requires them to forego their happiness, they be able to do so. If an agent is required to forego their happiness were not able to do so, it is not clear how they could have such a requirement, for according to Kant, ought implies can. Thus, the sense in which agents unavoidably pursue their own happiness cannot be so strong that it rules out the possibility of doing one's duty when duty and happiness are at variance with one another. This is an important result. Kant argues in the passage quoted above that agents do not have a duty to promote their own happiness, for this happens unavoidably apart from any command. But duty and happiness are not the same thing, and in cases of conflict, agents are able, and sometimes do, choose to forego happiness. Thus, Kant cannot mean that it is necessary that all agents in all instances pursue their happiness. This would be empirically false, and more importantly for the present purposes, in conflict with the central tenets of his moral theory. Yeah, I mean, that makes sense that Kant says, look, you as long as you have no external bounds on you, then you're going to do what makes you happy. That's fair. And then you can interpret that as like you could have like psychological bounds on you, and that's why you choose to do the wrong thing. Now, that wouldn't be a duty, but that would be maybe something in the same neighborhood, and that's why like you're not choosing your happiness because you've got like some sort of psychological block that's preventing you from doing what would make you happy. And I don't really love that, but it making Kant seem less ridiculous. And I think, at least in this area, we could say Kant may actually not be, might be like at least be non-ridiculous here. Like this seems to be a reasonable position that if you had nothing else to do, you'd do something that would make you happy. I don't know if that's true, but it's not a ridiculous statement. So, like, if I had nothing else to do, what would make me happy? I don't know. I'd do whatever the hell I want anyway. And drive myself nuts. Anywho, the duty to preserve one's life. One thing that Kant might mean in saying that agents promote their own happiness unavoidably is that every agent always has an immediate inclination to promote their own happiness. One might try to lever this into an argument against the duty to promote one's own happiness as follows. An agent can have a duty to X only if that agent does not have an immediate inclination to X. Because every agent always has an immediate inclination to promote their own happiness, no agent ever has a duty to promote their own happiness. This argument is valid, but it is not clear that Kant would adhere to it. It is not clear that Kant would adhere to this argument because it's not clear that Kant would adhere to the claim that an agent can have a duty to X only if that agent does not have an immediate inclination to X. In discussing the duty to preserve one's own life, Kant makes the following remark. To preserve one's life is a duty, and besides, everyone has an immediate inclination to do so. This quotation shows that Kant does not think that it is impossible for an agent to have an immediate inclination to X and to have a duty to X. This again is an important result. If agents do not have a duty to promote their own happiness, this cannot rest on the claim that, for Kant, an agent can have a duty to X only if that agent does not have an immediate inclination to X. However, one might still wonder whether Kant thinks that every agent always has an immediate inclination to promote their own happiness. In the next section, I argue that Kant thinks that immediate inclination and happiness can conflict, and that in such cases, agents can have an indirect duty to promote their own happiness. Yeah, I mean, this is the thing. It looks like Kant got himself into a little too much of a twist here. He bit off more than he could chew. He wants to say something, and then he realized, and then what happened was he got writing, and then he said a few contradictory things. He might have the right sort of like shape of the argument here, but it's not all working out for Kant, because basically the idea that you can't have a duty that to do something that you want to do seems ludicrous. It could just happen that these things align every so often. Maybe not that often, but every so often they do align. And the fact that your duty and your inclination align, that's fine. Like it would just seem dumb luck to always have it to have your inclinations and duties never align. That would be extremely ad hoc. Okay. In part 1 of the groundwork for a metaphysics of morals, Kant argues as follows. To assure one's own happiness is a duty, at least indirectly, for want of satisfaction with one's condition under pressure from many anxieties and amid unsatisfied needs easily could become a great temptation to transgression of duty. But in addition, without looking to duty here, all people have already of themselves the strongest and deepest inclination to happiness, because it is just in this idea that all inclinations unite in one sum. However, the precept of happiness is often so constituted that it greatly infringes upon some inclinations, and yet one can form no determinate and sure concept of the sum of satisfaction of all inclinations under the name happiness. Hence it is not to be wondered at that a single inclination determinate both as to what it promises and as to the time within which it can be satisfied, can often outweigh a fluctuating idea, and that a man, for example, one suffering from gout, can choose to enjoy what he likes to put up with and what he can, since, according to his calculations, on this occasion at least he has not sacrificed the enjoyment of the present moment to the perhaps groundless expectations of a happiness that is supposed to lie in health. Alright, so this is a whole mouthful. Basically, what I think he's saying here is, you might like to eat the ice cream even if it's going to give you a stomach ache. And so you have two different happinesses. You want to avoid the stomach ache because that will make you unhappy, and you want to eat the ice cream. So, that's basically what I think is going on here. You've got different inclinations, and they are at odds. Because you might know a food's going to give you a stomach ache but you like to eat it. But even in this case, when the general inclination to happiness did not determine his will, when health, at least for him, did not enter so necessary to this calculation, there is still left over here, as in all cases, a law, namely to promote his happiness not from inclination but from duty, and it is then that his conduct first has properly moral worth. Yeah, so Kant's just saying, look, as long as duty isn't involved, because the duty is the more important thing here, then these other stuff, I guess, matter less. Yeah. And this author says, in this passage, Kant tells us that happiness is the idea of the satisfaction of all inclinations united together. Further, he tells us that everybody has a strong and deep inclination for happiness, but he also tells us that happiness often infringes on single inclinations. In such cases, that is, in cases in which happiness infringes on single inclinations, agents have an indirect duty to promote their own happiness. Agents can and sometimes forego their happiness in favor of single inclinations. In Kant's example, the general inclination to happiness did not determine his will. But they should not do this. Agents have an indirect duty to promote their own happiness, because unhappiness can be a great temptation to transgression of duty. Thus, Kant thinks 1. It is possible for happiness and single inclinations to be at variance. 2. It is possible for agents to choose single inclinations or happiness when these two are at variance. And 3. Agents have an indirect duty to choose happiness when happiness and single inclinations are at variance. Yeah, so it's basically, you always choose duty over it. Your duty is to be happy, so you don't eat the ice cream because being sick later is going to make you much less happy. So doing some very utilitarian calculations here. In order to illustrate this, Kant describes a gout sufferer who describes happiness for enjoyment of the moment. To flesh out this example, imagine the following. Sir Leicester Dedlock is trying to decide whether to eat a meal of rich sausage and ham, which he knows will bring on an attack of gout the next day, or to eat a bowl of porridge and go to bed. The sausage and ham are quite tempting. He knows that eating the porridge would be prudent, but maybe he will feel bad tomorrow anyway. Or maybe he will die in his sleep and this will be his last meal. Or maybe someone will invent a cure for gout. See, my dad had gout, so I know what this is. And the pain is not that bad, is it? Happiness is too indeterminate and wavering an idea for Sir Leicester Dedlock. So, is it Leicester? Leicester? I wish I could speak better. So he throws it to the wind, perhaps by lying to himself, or more generally by rationalizing, perhaps not. He decides to eat the sausage and ham. In this case, Sir Leicester Dedlock chose to pursue a single inclination, the inclination for fine foods over happiness. But it is easy to imagine that Sir Leicester Dedlock's pain and discomfort the next day might tempt him to be disrespectful to the servants and to infringe on his moral duties. Thus, Sir Leicester Dedlock had an indirect duty to promote his own happiness and to eat the porridge rather than the rich meal. But he did not do so, he chose a single inclination instead. This result is more important than the ones from previous sections. It cannot be the case that the only ground for denying that agents have a duty to promote their own happiness is that they always have an immediate inclination to do so. And agents can fail to pursue their happiness not only if it is at variance with duty, agents can fail to pursue their happiness if it is at variance with a single inclination. When Kant says that agents unavoidably pursue their own happiness, he must mean something like what he says in passage at 4:399. Agents have the strongest and deepest inclination to happiness. However, agents can fail to act on this inclination when it is in conflict with duty or with other inclinations. Yeah. So this is like, this is like funny. This really consequentialist sort of reasoning here, that like you're trying to weigh the happiness versus your duties. Like if you're, it's funky. Whatever. It's Kant. Okay. And the duty to promote the greatest happiness is interesting too. Like the strongest and deepest thing, you have the strongest and deepest inclination to happiness. But why would you ever fail to that? Especially if you have like a duty to be as happy as possible, as was said earlier in the paper. Very strange that Kant would be saying that you have inclinations that do that. Maybe some sort of weakness of the will, acrasia, is what's going on here. Yeah, I don't know. Let me know if you have anyone out there has comments on this. Like, what kind of weakness is this? Is this just like a Kantian acrasia that's going on? It seems like that's kind of what this whole thing is. You have a duty to happiness, but then you're getting weakness of the will, and you are jumping at a lesser form of happiness. According to Kant, the moral law is expressed as an imperative to human agents because an imperative is an objective law of reason to a will that by its subjective constitution is not necessarily determined by it, a necessitation. Human agents do not follow the moral law by necessity. Even if some action is represented to a human agent as a good thing to do, they still might not perform that action, or they might not perform it on those grounds. Along the same lines, duty on Kant's account involves constraint. The concept of duty contains the concept of a good will, but it contains the concept of a good will under certain subjective limitations and hindrances. In particular, Kant thinks that an agent can have a duty to X only if they have a countervailing inclination. This helps to understand why Kant thinks the claim of self-love happens unavoidably moots the duty to promote one's own happiness. If the agent promote their own happiness unavoidably, or if self-love is inevitable, then there can be no duty to promote one's happiness. Yeah, because it would just be, where would the duty come from? You wouldn't have an external reason to do it if you're always doing it anyway. But of course, you could have an abstract sort of sense of one, I guess. Like the derivative. You see, I don't know. I'm starting to disagree with the author here. Let's see what they say in the next sentence. You could have like derivative duties, and so you could have derivative duties to other duties that sort of do correlate to things that are inevitable for yourself. I'm thinking here. But here's what the author says. However, as we are now in a position to see, the problem with this argument is that, based on Kant's own philosophy, it is not true in any relevant sense that agents unavoidably promote their own happiness, or that self-love is inevitable. That is, any sense in which agents do unavoidably promote their own happiness, or in which self-love is inevitable, is not strong enough to preclude a duty to promote one's own happiness. Okay, I'm in agreement with the author here. Not only is it false that agents always do promote their own happiness, as seen in section 1, but even if agents always have an inclination to do so, this is consistent with their having a duty to promote their own happiness, as seen in section 2, because agents also have countervailing inclinations, as seen in section 3. So if the arguments in the previous section are sound, then Kant's arguing for denying a duty to promote one's own happiness is not. But this does not show that there is such a duty. So that is what I'm going to try to do now. Okay, so this is exactly what I was hoping would happen. Is that, look, you can have derivative duties, and I think that's what the author is doing here. I'm getting a little tired, though. Getting confused with my own thoughts. That's okay. We're on page 8 of 12. And yeah, we're going down. And that's it. 8 of 11, really. More at the bottom of 8. So we'll be okay. One way to show this might be to focus on Kant's claim that there is an indirect duty to promote one's own happiness. In her recent work on Kant's anthropology, Cohen argues that indirect duties in general have a genuine normative force. She argues for this on the grounds that they can be interpreted as duties that are indirectly prescribed as means to the realization of a direct duty, namely the direct imperfect duty that commands the pursuit of one's own perfection. Cohen's idea is to appeal to the hypothetical imperative in conjunction with a direct duty. If an agent A ought to X, and if Y is a necessary means to X, then one's own happiness is a necessary means thereto. Oh, sorry, I missed the line. If an agent A ought to X, and if Y is a necessary means to X, then A ought to Y. One ought to pursue one's own perfection, according to Cohen. Promoting one's own happiness is a necessary means thereto, so one ought to promote one's own happiness. The problem with this strategy, however, is that promoting one's own happiness is not a necessary means to the realization of one's own perfection. On Kant's account, promoting one's own happiness enables one to be moral in the same way that not buying cookies makes it easier to stick to one's diet. That is, it is much easier not to eat junk food if it is not there. So it makes sense not to stock up on chips if trying to lose weight. When parents go on diets, kids often get dragged along. But even if the junk food is there, one need not eat it. So appealing to the hypothetical imperative does not help. It is because of this that some commentators maintain that indirect duties are not actually duties properly so called. That's interesting. I didn't know that this is how it would go in Kant. But yeah, because there's a multiple realization on how to satisfy laws. So yeah, I mean, just from my philosophy of science background, there's multiple realization on satisfying laws. And so therefore, if you have a duty, there's more than one way to realize it, so you can't immediately assume that some sub-duty is necessary, because there's more than one way to satisfy that law, or that duty, in this case. An alternative approach might be to note that in the indirect-direct duty distinction seems to be unstable in Kant's work. For instance, in the Metaphysics of Morals, Kant argues for the duty to promote one's natural talents, a direct duty, on the grounds that a human being has a duty to himself to be a useful member of the world, since this also belongs to the worth of humanity in his own person, which he ought not to degrade. The problem with Kant's argument here is that promoting one's natural talents is neither necessary nor sufficient for being a useful member of the world. Yeah, you can be useful in other ways. The independently wealthy athlete who practices tennis alone all day, every day, is not a useful member of the world. And there are plenty of useful things one could do without being a specialist or having any particular talents, cultivated or not. Cultivating one's talents might make it easier to be a useful member of the world, or it might enable one to become a more useful member of the world, assuming that usefulness to the world can be ordered lexically. But the same could be said about promoting one's own happiness in relation to one's other duties. Again, multiply realizability. So there's no necessity to any one. You just have to have some way of being useful to the world. However, even if the indirect-direct duty distinction is unstable in the way suggested in the previous paragraph, this does not show that there is a duty to promote one's own happiness. Indeed, perhaps some would argue that it shows only that the Metaphysics of Morals derivation of the duty to promote one's natural talent does not work. So appealing to the indirect duty discussed in section 3 looks like it will be an uphill battle. Accordingly, I would like to offer an independent argument for a direct duty to promote one's own happiness on the basis of interpersonal considerations. Okay, so we're going to have a not a Kantian reconstruction, but basically an argument replacing Kant's flawed arguments here, which is kind of cool. According to Kant, every agent has a duty to treat humanity in their own person as an end. But I want to argue that any agent who constantly is promoting the happiness of others at the expense promoting the happiness of others at the expense of their own is not treating their own humanity as an end. That is, such an agent seems to be expressing a value judgment, specifically that their happiness is of lesser value and, hence, that their humanity is of lesser value than that of other people whom they are constantly serving. Okay, so this is don't make a martyr of yourself. I find that odd, but at least for Kantian thing, because it wouldn't be to make a martyr of yourself be a supererogative thing. But yeah, I don't know. Let's see what the author continues with. Of course, an agent might take great joy in sacrificing their own aims and long-term plans. Indeed, sacrificing one's own happiness for the sake of others might satisfy an inclination, for example, the inclination to be seen as self-sacrificing. But it is important to be clear here. If the bond between two people is so strong that their respective conceptions of happiness become intertwined, then it might not make sense to say that one is sacrificing their happiness for the other. Rather, it might be a hard case in which the person has to make a choice about how best to pursue their happiness given the harsh reality of an uncompromising world. For example, parents often make great sacrifices for their children. It is not always correct to say that they sacrifice their happiness for their children's happiness, although sometimes, no doubt, it is so. Sometimes it would be more accurate to say that they are sacrificing one life goal that previously had factored into their happiness for the sake of another after realizing that these two goals are, for one reason or another, mutually exclusive. This is not to say that such sacrifices are easy or unimportant, nor is it to say that they are not sacrifices. Rather, it is to say that such cases are not what I have in mind here. Along the same lines, an agent might have a very good reason to sacrifice their own happiness, both in the short term and in the long term. This is obviously for agents whose happiness is bound up with morally abhorrent ends, and it also can be for agents with more quotidian aims, but this again is not what I have in mind here. What I have in mind here is that care for the happiness of others, and especially an official care for the happiness of others at the expense of one's own happiness, is immoral if it expresses a devaluation of oneself or an arrogant pride. Indeed, simply not taking an interest in one's own happiness, even if not accompanied by officiousness, is immoral insofar as it expresses a devaluation of oneself. On these grounds, I want to argue there is a general duty to promote one's own happiness, provided one does so consistently with the duty to promote the happiness of all. Okay, so I think this is a self-debasement argument. Since you are human, you shouldn't debase all humans, and you are human, therefore you shouldn't debase yourself. That's actually not bad. I can see Kant getting on, being okay with that, especially if you're a white man. A white man should not debase themselves. You can debase other races and genders, but white men should not debase themselves, because that would be bad for Kant. But I kind of like the idea of like an anti-debate. So there's Kantian anti-self debasement. Dagnabbit. There we go. So that's what's going on here. So if you have a argument for non-self-debasement on the theory that you're a person, you shouldn't debase people, and therefore you shouldn't debase yourself, then you have to maintain your happiness, because it would debase you to ignore someone's happiness. Okay. A somewhat frivolous example might help to make the point. Suppose that two friends, Karsten and Claire, go to an amusement park together. They are trying to decide which rides to go on, which booths to eat from, which characters to pose for pictures with, and so forth. Further, suppose that they end up going to Karsten's favorite rides, eating at Karsten's favorite booths, etc. Finally, suppose the decision process is not undemocratic, determined or undermined or insincere and manipulative. It is not that one of the two is hijacking the decisions, unilaterally declaring the next step in the game plan, ready to throw a tantrum if they do not get their way, or being hammed up in anticipation of some later decision. Moreover, it is not Karsten's birthday, nor are they there because Claire is trying to make up to Karsten for some previous foible. For my purpose, Karsten need not know that although the decision process is equitable, its results are not. Nor need it be the case that Claire actively dislikes Karsten's favorite rides, foods, etc. Each individual decision is no great sacrifice, and even on the whole, Karsten's happiness does not come at the price of Claire's misery. Rather, Claire simply rates Karsten's happiness as more important than her own, and she therefore pushes for his preference over her own. And this need not be something about Claire and Karsten in particular. Perhaps Claire would have behaved this way with anyone. I maintain that in this example there is a misvaluation of the worth of a rational being evinced through a misvaluation of worth of her preferences when pitted against those of another. The premises I need to support this idea are, I believe, as follows. First, that all rational beings have equal moral worth, and second, that one of the ways in which the value of rational beings is expressed is through the value attributed to their happiness as a complex of various ends, preferences, and inclinations. If these two premises are correct, then there is an important misvaluation of the worth of one's rational being in relation to another when one person fails to value sufficiently someone else's happiness in relation to their own. But there is also an important misvaluation of the worth of one's rational being in relation to another when one person fails to value sufficiently his or their own happiness in relation to someone else's. It is the second kind of misvaluation that underlies the duty to promote one's own happiness. Yeah, so basically, if you are simping so hard that you are making an ass of yourself, then you have debased yourself. Do not simp that hard. Like, this goes bad. Like, if you're gonna put this in Twitch terms, it's just not good. Now, here's the question though. Having equal moral worth, and then is the way the which that is shown is through happiness as a complex of various ends, preferences, and inclinations. How exactly is moral worth and your happiness related? The author here is just assuming it is. I guess so. As a full human being, you have something called happiness. But yeah, I mean, that's unclear exactly how that goes. And so is it unclear about how much debasement a person can allow for? I don't know. Okay, but I think the point generally stands. You shouldn't be debasing yourself. For no good reason, at least. Like, if there's a duty to, like, save someone's life, maybe debasing yourself is the right thing to do at that time in order to save someone else's life. What do you care if you make an ass of yourself that time? Someone lived. But, like, yeah. Now, you shouldn't also forego all your happiness, because happiness is a part of being human, and therefore you shouldn't debase yourself, or you shouldn't overly debase yourself if you have no other reason. Okay, let's finish this up. I think this is actually it. Of course, there might be other arguments that one might make in favor of the idea that there is a duty to promote one's own happiness. Perhaps, for example, in addition to the interpersonal argument I am pushing here, an intrapersonal argument could be made, perhaps appealing to the way in which one values one's current utility as compared with how one values the utility of one's past and or future selves. But the point is that if I am right, then there are good Kantian grounds for thinking not only that Kant's argument against a general duty to promote one's own happiness is contradicted by what he says elsewhere, but also that there is actually such a duty. Okay, you know, I don't like Kant. I don't care that Kant got something wrong. I mean, that does make Kant pretty normal. Everyone gets something wrong. It's not particularly special. But the idea that you can say something with Kant's philosophy that you should not debase yourself, that is a nice result. I like that. And you know what? There's a lot of Kantians out there running around in, like, away from the philosophy section, but people seem to really like Kantian reasoning. I find out in the wild. There's a lot of it going on. And so the idea that I can tell people to stop simping in a Kantian way, I like that I have this resource that I say, hey, look, stop debasing yourself. You're a person. People shouldn't be debased. And some people are going to, do the psychological thing and be like, oh, I'm not worth anything, and therefore it doesn't matter if I'm debased. I'd be like, Kant would disagree with you. You're human. You're rational. You have a limit to what you should be, how debased you should be, and and part of that limit is that you need to be at least a little bit happy. As a human person, you should have to accept that being a little bit happy is part of being human. And if you think you can just go on and be like completely miserable, then you're screwing something up, because happiness is part of rationality. So the fact that, like, I could make that argument to that was probably, I'd have to think about how to say it a bit more effectively nowadays. But, like, look, like, the anti-debasement argument, like, it's anti-Kantian to like debase people, and you are people, and therefore you shouldn't self-debase. And so like you hear Doomer speak, and you can like the fact that you can argue about against that so quickly using this argument when someone else has like overly done this as the author's example here was, what like if someone is always giving, you have to say, hey, look, you have to take some time for yourself. You have to go eat some food you like, because you are doing a person wrong. That person happens to be yourself, but you're doing a person wrong because it's irrational or morally it's you're failing in your moral duty to a person. The person happens to be yourself if you do not at least satisfy the rational requirement of looking to be happy at least sometimes. So yeah. Anyone have anything to say about that? I've now been streaming for about 2 hours and 20 minutes. So probably going to be it for tonight. We're coming up on 11:30 in the evening. This was a nice paper. Like, I'd have to be Kantian to really care. But like, I have no problem with this. Like, as far as I'm not a Kantian, I can't say if anything this author said about Kant's reasoning, arguments, and stuff is correct. But like I said, the idea that it came up with a reconstruction of how Kant should have argued, given that Kant seems to be a little bit off on this topic, just in terms of experience, then that's an interesting, like, it's like, okay, if this is like one of those, if you're in a tradition, like, you can give an argument that like should have been made by like a saint or a big whatever it is, someone in that tradition. You say, look, they didn't get it right, but we can fix this up from what they said. And like, as a like person in good standing in the community, you can say, hey, look, we all love Kant, but he didn't get everything right, but like, this is what he should have said if he had maybe had a little bit more time working on this. So that's nice. And like I said, I like it because it gives me a quick response to some doomer talk that's saying, hey, look, you can't be self-debasing. And I think that would actually be effective nowadays among people who have sort of these Kantian inclinations. And I do see I see Kantian reasoning all over the place. It's widespread, I feel.